Myself, Dr. Kamini Mittal. I am guest faculty at Center of Food Technology of University of Allahabad, and I am presenting before you Module 3 of Paper 8, that is the paper of Women and Health, which comes under the subject of Women's Studies. The title of this module is Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights as a Key Dimension of Women's Health. This is part 1 of this module. The author is Dr. B. Subhasri from Rural Women's Social Education Center, Tamil Nadu, and Ms. Bhuvaneshwari Sunil, who is researcher at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Herein, we are dealing with sexual and reproductive health and rights in India, the definition of the concepts involved, namely sexual rights, reproductive rights, sexual health, reproductive health, and lastly, what is the need for SRHR? The right of every human being to enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health forms the basis for the Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights (SRHR) as enshrined in Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights 1966. The right includes both health care provided by the government and the right to have equal opportunities or access to resource and condition necessary for being healthy. Tracing the history of SRHR in India, India was the first country to implement a population stabilization program in the year 1952. But the family planning programs during the 70s became compulsive and coercive, and so made it an unpopular program. A reproductive health approach to achieve the goals of the National Population Policy of 2000 was designed through the National Rural Health Mission. Family planning programs were introduced into the Reproductive and Child Health program in 2005. Now, as far as sexuality and sexual rights are concerned, predominantly the sexual health discourse and intervention remain within the larger pretext of reproductive health. It is not talked about as an independent identity. A major barrier to working on sexuality has been India's approach and emphasis to abstinence only education and messages. The HIV platform emphasized the need for sexuality education and sexuality rights into the main discourse. Now we have activists who addressed issues of stigma and discrimination against people living with AIDS and sexual minority groups as human rights issues. Talking about firstly the reproductive rights. There was a global evolution and fight for recognizing the sexual and reproductive health and rights of women during the second half of the 20th century. International Women's Health Movement of 80s, IWHM, made a distinction between women's right to control their fertility and the state-imposed population control. In 1994, the concept of reproductive health received due attention in the famous United Nations International Conference on Population and Development (ICPD) held in Cairo. A full definition of reproductive health can be given. Reproductive health actually is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity in all matters relating to the reproductive system and to its functions and processes. Reproductive health therefore implies that people are able to have a satisfying and safe sex life, and they have the capability to reproduce and the freedom to decide if, when, and how often to do so. Implicit in this last condition are the right of men and women to be informed and to have access to safe, effective, affordable, and acceptable methods of family planning of their choice, as well as other methods of their choice for regulation of fertility, which are not against the law, and the right of access to appropriate health care services that will enable women to go safely through pregnancy and childbirth and provide couples with the best chance of having a healthy infant. This was discussed or given, this definition was given by the Platform for Action of Beijing Declaration. The aim of this definition was to put women at the center of the process, to recognize, respect, and respond to the needs of women and not just to the needs of the mothers. As women's human rights cannot be realized without promoting women's reproductive rights, the reproductive rights of women were recognized within the larger human rights framework. Now, the 12 human rights that were key to reproductive rights were identified. Although they keep evolving at every stage, but we can list these 12 of them. The right to life, the right to liberty and security of person, the right to health including sexual and reproductive health, the right to decide the number and spacing of children, the right to consent to marriage and to equality in marriage, the right to privacy, the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to be free from practices that harm women and girls, the right to not be subjected to torture or other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, the right to be free from sexual and gender-based violence, the right to access sexual and reproductive health education and family planning information, the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress. These are the 12 human rights. We clearly recognize that the right to health includes the right to control one's health and body, sexual and reproductive freedom, and freedom from torture, non-consensual medical treatment and experimentation. Further, what needs to be elaborated is that reproductive rights are just not the same as sexual rights. They are non-reproductive sexual rights, like those related to non-procreative, that is, not related to birth, or non-heterosexual sexual activities. Next, we talk about the concept of sexual rights. The parameters of sexual rights are defined as the full range of existing human rights that have been applied to public and private aspects of sexuality and sexual health. Now, promotion of sexual health has occurred in 3 ways. Firstly, broadening the understanding of traditional human rights covenants to include sexuality issues. Secondly, conceptualizing sexual and reproductive health and rights, that is, understanding the 4 concepts of sexual rights, reproductive rights, sexual health, and reproductive health. And lastly, speaking clearly and effectively about sexual autonomy and the right to pleasure. Now, how do we define sexual rights? Sexual rights have been defined as a fundamental element of human rights. They encompass the rights to experience a pleasurable sexuality, which is essential in and of itself, and at the same time is a fundamental vehicle of communication and love between people. There is yet another definition of sexual rights. It says, the application of existing human rights to sexuality and sexual health constitute sexual rights. Sexual rights protect all people's rights to fulfill and express their sexuality and enjoy sexual health with due regards to the rights of others within a framework of protection against discrimination. Rights that are critical to sexual health can be listed. Actually, whenever you talk about sexual health, there are certain rights which have to be taken into consideration, like the right to sexual pleasure without fear of infection, disease, unwanted pregnancy or harm, like to make choice based on consent on who their partners are, what kind of sex they want to engage in, and every other issue regarding their sexuality that are consistent with one's personal, ethical and social values. To have or not to have sex in all contexts, including marriages and paid sex. To have sex with one or more people simultaneously if all involved consent to it. To marry or not to marry with full and free consent and without coercion. To play, discover, have fun with one's sexuality. To sell and buy sex. To differ on the issue of sex. To obtain information and privacy and confidentiality while seeking sexual and reproductive health care services. And lastly, to advertise sexual services. To produce, use and advertise sex objects and sexually explicit materials. To claim gender and sexual identities irrespective of one's biological status. To express oneself without discrimination because one is different. To live in a life free of coercion, violation, discrimination based on sexual identity and practices. To experience the unfettered practice of one's sexuality in all spheres of activity except sexual abuse, and to enjoy a positive and affirmative sex. So, there is a host of areas in which these rights have to be considered. Now, sexual rights are based on certain ethical principles. First, the principle of bodily integrity or the right to security in and control over one's body. Bodily integrity means all individuals have a right to not only be protected from harm to the body, but also to enjoy full potential of the body. The second principle is that of personhood and the right to self-determination for all. Personhood means status of being a person. It is closely tied with legal and political concepts of citizenship, equality and liberty. The third is the principle of equality, and the fourth principle is diversity, implying difference. Incorporating sexual health into the mainstream has proven to be challenging. Actually, religious fundamentalism and the rising right-wing presence has also been another cause for setting back the efforts to integrate sexuality, gender and rights into practice. The Millennium Development Goal Agenda provided a scope for advancing women's reproductive rights. In reality, the larger context of sexual health was earlier out of the boundaries. Now, SDGs are towards incorporating the SRHR framework. The third concept is that of reproductive health. Now, reproductive health offers a comprehensive and integrated approach to the health needs of reproduction. What is the definition? Reproductive health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity in all matters relating to the reproductive system. It implies a satisfying and safe sex life, the capability to reduce, and right to decide if, when, and how often to do so. To be informed and to have access to safe, effective, affordable, and acceptable methods of family planning, safe pregnancy, childbirth, and a healthy infant. Methods, techniques, and services that contribute to reproductive health and well-being by preventing and solving reproductive health problems can be accessed. Sexual health, which is not merely related to care and counseling, but the enhancement of life and personal relationship and a life cycle approach. Lastly, the concept of sexual health has been defined in the ICPD program of action as the enhancement of life and personal relations, and not merely counseling and care related to reproduction and sexually transmitted diseases. It should include the ability to enjoy mutually fulfilling sexual relationships, freedom from sexual abuse, coercion, or harassment, safety from sexually transmitted disease, and very importantly, success in achieving or in preventing pregnancy. Now, what is the need for SRHR? The primary need is to improve women's lives. People have been very concerned about sexual health, but the issue has been limited to surviving sex, and they have also been concerned about reproductive health, but again the issue has been limited to surviving production. Further, sex and sexuality are topics of debate, and therefore they silence the sexual rights aspects. Control of women's sexuality, accompanied by lack of respect for their autonomy and self-determination over their bodies, pose harmful consequences. It is important to recognize that women's health is more than reproductive health, that women have specific health needs related to their sexual and reproductive function. The socio-economic condition, the lifestyle, behavior, play a role in undermining of productive, reproductive, and sexual health. Thank you.